Hey everyone, so here are our videos on 6.4 and 6.5, the interwar period as I'm calling it, because these are the two chapters about the stuff that occurs in between World War One and World War Two. In World War Two, I think we don't have Nazism. I think that's in the next chapter. But like how I've been doing the videos all year, and we're gonna start with the key terms for 6.4. Now, just a heads up, because there are 35 key terms in here. I'm just gonna post the link to this presentation in the YouTube video, just so you can just copy these, because honestly, like 35 key terms is a lot. I would have done this before we had, the ice apocalypse, but it's even more apt now. Okay, so if you want to copy them, you can pause as I'm talking, and that's fine too. But yeah, I mean, the number 20 is kind of a hard one to define, but now we have one more page into this one. And finally, okay, so that's all of them. Now, let's go into the interwar period. So we're talking mainly about the Great Depression for this economics of before World War II. So Germany is in some trouble. Now, again, I think I mentioned this last time in the video. Like this stuff that we're covering today in this video is stuff I cover in a whole 6 weeks of IB history. So I'm going to try and keep myself under control. But in general, Germany has a crappy economy. It lost its empire. It's forced to pay reparations. Its economy was devastated by the strains caused by World War I. And kind of the massive consequence of that is that most of Europe becomes dependent on the U.S. financial system to fund their governments. They're taking out massive loans from banks in the United States. Okay. At the same time, during the Roaring '20s, Americans are doing something called buying on the margin, where they're taking out loans to invest in the stock market to then pay off the debt and keep the profit. When the stock market crashes through a series of different events, the financial system buckles. The U.S. financial system buckles. And what that means is that, like, the system that had been keeping European governments afloat after World War I collapsed. And there's no way that these governments can stay stable anymore. Germany in particular, because of choices that they made in regards of their currency and paying reparations, essentially what was happening was the Germany would take out loans from the U.S. to pay reparations to the European countries of World War I from the Treaty of Versailles. After that, the European nations who received the reparations would pay the reparations to the U.S., who would loan the money back out to Germany. It was a cycle. And essentially it led to like zero net reparations being paid, but it was the way to keep Germany stable, because the fear was that Germany being unstable would be bad for Europe. What do you know? That's actually true. So another development during this time, a response to the economic catastrophe caused by the Great Depression, is led by a man named John Maynard Keynes, who is an interesting economist. You read a lot if you have an IB history. One of the kind of key things that he led to was something that deviated historically from government behavior, and that was deficit spending. So historically, governments would balance the budget. They would only spend what they took in on revenue, and they would try to avoid debt. Keynes said, screw the debt, save the country, save the economy, and that can get you out of this massive depression. The ways you can increase your deficit to stimulate the economy would be to cut taxes, which would be to lower the burden that your citizens are paying toward the government so they can spend their money more in the private sector, or the government can increase spending. America likes to do a little bit of both of those things. So that's like there's two ways. So you can either reduce revenue, but then increase resources for your citizens to spend money, or keep revenue the same and increase your spending. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is elected in 1930 or 32, I think 32. On this policy, I think it's 30 actually, on this policy of Keynesian economics, and it's called the New Deal. It's largely successful, but in order for it to have been comprehensively successful, the New Deal needed to have worked a lot more, done a lot more, and ultimately FDR does not have the political capital required to keep pushing the New Deal through. He has some problems in the courts. He has some problems in Congress, even though he has a supermajority in the Senate and in the House. He has some troubles politically to get that through. Ultimately, it's World War II that brings America and then America out of the Great Depression. But I mean, from 1929 to about 1945, it sucks to be a European. Now, the other big things that led to another issue that kind of exacerbated the consequences of the Great Depression was a policy called beggar thy neighbor. So when the banks collapse, the financial system collapses, most of the private sectors in capitalist economies function in a similar way of taking on loans at the beginning of a fiscal quarter to then invest in what were seen to be profitable enterprises that then would pay off the loan, and then they could keep the profits afterwards. So the financial system is like integral to how most businesses worked in capitalist countries. When the Great Depression happens, the domestic industries of most countries start straining immensely. So they start really struggling. The government response to that is to institute a protectionist trade policy, which is an anti-globalization, anti-liberal policy of free trade. It is to increase tariffs on foreign goods so that your domestic goods can be competitive in the domestic market. They don't have to compete with cheaper foreign goods. What that means is that governments that have trade-based economies were hit even harder, one of them mainly being Japan. So one of the reasons why Japan becomes so radicalized in the 1930s is because of the trade policies. But in general, most exporting-based countries are hurt the most by the Great Depression. And I want to note, I promise this will not be a long tangent, a lot of the former Austro-Hungarian states, like Austria or Hungary or Poland, all of these countries, they were export-based economies. And so when protectionism is instilled throughout the world, these countries that were focused on exporting their goods, their raw materials that were refined by industrial economies, they failed. They became weaker, more vulnerable. And specifically Poland, that's going to be relevant for World War II. So that's all I want to talk about with that. I could talk about that for another whole 6 weeks. In the same way, this is more 1920s where the roaring 20s aren't roaring very much. That's Russia and Mexico. So the Russian Civil War comes to an end in the early to mid 1920s. The Bolshevik Party, yes, I saw that right. Okay, the Bolshevik Party is the victors of the Russian Civil War, and Lenin attempts to institute socialism, and he's kind of trailblazing because no one's ever tried this before. Ultimately, their first attempts don't really fail. And so he has to institute a type of mixed market communism and capitalism where the government is planning the economy. They are guiding the economy a great deal, but there needs to be some kind of market that's motivating people a little bit more because the early attempts of collectivization met with a great deal of resistance from the peasant class because they had been fighting now for upwards of 80 years for freedom and economic freedom specifically. So when the Tsar is overthrown and the Bolsheviks are in power under this mantle of liberty and equality, they're being told they all have to work on these farms and give their produce to the government to be then distributed to the rest of the world and not being rewarded for that. And so the peasants don't really want to be very productive. And so they aren't productive. So Lenin, he unexpectedly has a stroke in the let's say late 20s or early 30s, and he's succeeded by a man who wasn't necessarily the next in power. He was influential in the Bolshevik Party. He was a Georgian, not the Georgia of the country, a Georgian named Joseph Stalin. And Stalin is able to kind of muscle his way past Leon Trotsky, who was maybe seen as the at least ideological successor of Lenin. And he follows through on socialist policies, but is far more coercive with force. So he ends up killing lots of people trying to institute communism and socialism, and this kind of mixed market thing that Lenin was trying to moderate and ease the people into communism. That doesn't go. Stalin just says, "You don't agree with me? To the gulag you go," and they went. And it's rough in Russia for. I don't know. It's probably still kind of rough in Russia, honestly. Throughout this period, the 1920s and 30s, Stalin evolves his power into a totalitarian government. He purges people who threaten his loyalty. He really consolidates the control of the Soviet Union under his control. So the Soviet Union becomes his interest, not necessarily the interest of communism, and sometimes those are one and the same. Now, in Mexico, the revolution finally ends in the 1920s, and the IRP comes to power. They ultimately provide some type of stabilization towards Mexico through the nationalization of the oil industry. Something that's transformative of the 20th century is with the advent of the automobile, oil becomes, and the invention of the internal combustion engine and things like that, oil becomes essential to economies. So countries that had been historically economically weak now had a reason to had something that made them so successful. So when we talk about like the resource wealth of Mexico, way back in the early modern era, we talked about silver and how Mexico was like one of the linchpins of the Spanish power. Now, another resource that Mexico is wealthy in, oil, is a reason that gives Mexico stability. And the IRP stays in power in Mexico until the 1970s. So both, at the end of this, both Mexico and Russia achieve some degree of political stability in different ways. The IRP comes to power and leads stability through economic means, where Stalin provides stability in political means, using the state to kind of suppress people who could challenge him. Now, okay, so the other thing that comes out of the interwar period politically is the rise of fascism and right-wing governments. So it's hard to nail down fascism. Some historians would say that the only fascists were Italian fascists and Nazis. Like then any kind of attempt to connect them to contemporary neo-Nazis or white nationalists or things like that isn't quite accurate. I guess that's a way to see it. So let's just talk about it in this period we're talking about right now, the 1930s and 20s and 30s. So fascism is the ultimate ideological conclusion of nationalism. If you just take nationalism to its ideological kind of conclusion, it's fascism. That like your state is superior to all. People who are not a part of the state are weak. People deserve to should essentially worship the state. In a religion, in a way, like we talked about throughout the 19th century, of the increasing power the state had over the lives of its citizens, especially as a consequence of industrialization. Fascism is kind of like the implementation of how much a government can control its population. So people, don't have lots of rights. They don't have any kinds of legal protections. The state exists in and of itself and expects the population to support its own existence. Historically, fascism is conservative, which means that it appeals to how things have been, and is also often fearful of progress. That anything that stuff can be disruptive. The term is also known as reactionary. So reactionary would be that it proposes that there is an external threat that is dangerous to the state, to the existence of the state. And therefore, this reaction is used to warrant the actions of a fascist state. So that is to oppress its people, to target minorities, to attack other nations because of this supposed fear of its own existence. Oftentimes that's not the case. These are often trumped up things, and you can look at examples of Italy invading Abyssinia, as the textbook talks about, or Hitler invading Poland, as examples of these things that are not true. Like Poland could not have held up to Germany even on a one-on-one fight, let alone the Soviet Union invading it from the east. So Italian fascism is led by a man named Benito Mussolini, and the two terms I want you guys to be familiar with, I know they're terms I defined in the early parts of the presentation, but totalitarianism, which is something I just referenced with Stalin as well. That's a connection between Stalin and Mussolini, is that the state uses its power to exert total control over the lives of its citizens. Okay. Another thing that Mussolini uses is even a thing that we even use today in our country called corporatism, that the different things that make up the state should have a say in how they run. And so long as they are good for the state, they're allowed to do that. So, for example, lobbying is an example of corporatism, that companies have a say in what regulations they're kind of being held accountable to. And to some extent, there's a logic in that, right? Because chicken producers kind of know the industry in and out. They should know what are the best and safest practices, right? The problem is that when it's only the people who own chicken companies, not all the people in the production system, that have a say in regulation, right? Because then employees can be pretty abused in the meatpacking industry. If you watched Last Week Tonight, earlier this week. Now, when Mussolini comes to power, there's an interesting development to this. Remember, Italy was a part of the Entente during World War I, that the Allies, in fact, needed Italy to maintain stability in Europe. And so while Mussolini ultimately is rather sympathetic to Hitler, the fact the Allies need Mussolini mean that Mussolini is able to get away with a lot of hijinks, like, for example, supporting the Spanish Civil War or invading Abyssinia in East Africa. So that's a gist of the first crisis of the right-wing government. Now, this book spends a ton of time in the Spanish Civil War, and I don't quite know why, but we'll talk about it. So, Spain attempts to become a democracy. The King of Spain abdicates. The elections occur. The Republicans, which are a left-leaning group, are able to form a coalition, but a reaction to this left wing, I would not say it's far left, but left wing victory, is there's a reaction within the military of Spain led by a man named Francisco Franco. And the Spanish Civil War is essentially between the legitimately elected government of Spain, these are the Republicans, and a military group, a group of the army led by Francisco Franco, who call themselves the Royalists. But they're essentially fascists because they're reactionary, they're conservative, they also call themselves royalists because they want to put the king back on the throne. But when this royalists end up winning the Spanish Civil War, it's not the king who gets put back on the throne, it's Franco who becomes the leader of Spain. Another event that the book highlights, it's interesting that they did, is Guernica, which is an example of contemporary technology. It's one of the first uses of mass airplane bombing of a population center, to the extent that we're going to see in World War II. It's a Basque town, which is Basques are a part in as ethnic group that is distinctive from romantic culture groups like the Spanish or the French or the Germans and things like that. And they were nationalists. They were they were a part of the Republicans because they believed, as a very small ethnic minority, a democracy would protect them more than an autocracy. So they sided with the Republicans. They got bombed by the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force and the Italian Air Force. And it's immortalized by a very famous painting by Pablo Picasso, it's just cool. I would recommend you look it up. It's a very moving piece of art. There's a story, but I don't want to tell it because I don't want to be too long in this video. Okay, so the Spanish Civil War becomes kind of a point of tension between the interest groups of Europe before World War II. there are kind of three parties we need to talk about. The USSR supports parts of the left-leaning Republicans. So there are anarchists, there are communists, there are liberals, there are Basque nationalists, Galician nationalists, Barcelona nationalists. All these groups are a part of the Republicans. It's a pretty uneasy group. Like they only are united in the fact that the fascists want to destroy them, and they want to be a democracy. But they don't have like an ideological connection. Some of them aren't even fighting together. Some of them are fighting each other. For example, Stalin was, not only funding the Spanish communists, but also smuggling some communist soldiers into Spain. And in fact, there are examples of Stalin like killing ordering the execution and killing of other Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. But he sees it as a chance to expand the breadth of communism during this period. Italy and Germany support the loyalists or the Republicans. The royalists, because Mussolini saw it as a chance to expand fascism and kind of create not a puppet state, but an allied state. And democracies, which are Britain and France, neglect to do anything. They were fearful of getting involved in a war. Wars are expensive. The next chapter is going to talk about appeasement and the great failure of European foreign policy during the 1920s and 30s. Franco wins. That's the gist of in general. He was receiving direct foreign support, not like specific targeted support, like what the USSR was doing. Now, another example of the rise of right-wing governments is Brazil. So Brazil is a pretty industrial state at this point. Sadly, we're going to talk about Pedro II, but he's a really cool guy. I'd recommend you look into Pedro II, King of Brazil, Emperor of Brazil. So Vargas is the leader of Brazil, becomes a power in a coup. He becomes a dictator. He's kind of fascist. He's like reactionary. He's anti-communist, kind of dictatorial. Ultimately, he sides with the Allies, though, because it's pragmatic for him to do so. So he's not fascist in the way that he wants to expand like this reactionary right-wing conservatism. He just wants to benefit himself. So he stays in power for a little bit after World War II. All right, so that's our first chapter on the economy.